Imagine someone rehearsing a lie in their head before they've even been asked a question. Not a lie about the affair itself, a lie about themselves. Their sister might call this weekend and ask how things are going, and they're already deciding what they'll say. Fine. Busy. Nothing new. They're not planning to mention that they know their husband is still texting someone else, or that they've decided, for now, to stay. They've run this conversation in their mind a dozen times, and every version ends the same way, with silence about the one thing that's actually taking up most of their waking thoughts. What strikes me about this, and what I want to spend this episode on, is that the silence isn't really about protecting a secret. It's about protecting themselves from a very specific kind of judgment, one that has almost nothing to do with the affair and everything to do with the choice to remain. Welcome back to Strides to Solutions. I'm Esther Adams, and this is the second episode in our series on betrayal trauma inside ongoing marriages. Last time, we spent the whole hour inside the nervous system, walking through what betrayal trauma theory actually explains, why attachment to the person causing harm creates a genuine psychological trap rather than a simple failure of willpower, and how continuous, unresolved betrayal produces something closer to chronic traumatic stress than a single healing wound. Toward the end of that episode, I mentioned something I only had time to gesture at, which is the profound silence that tends to surround this experience. Today, I want to slow down and actually take that apart because there's a specific kind of shame buried inside that silence, and it turns out to be meaningfully different from the shame of having been betrayed in the first place. Here's the distinction I want to draw out carefully because I think it gets collapsed together in most casual conversation, even in a lot of clinical conversation. There is the shame of having been cheated on. That's what we might call betrayal shame, and it tends to sound like this internally. I wasn't enough. I should have seen it coming. What does it say about me that this happened? That version of shame is fundamentally about self worth. It's evaluative, turned inward, asking whether the person is fundamentally lovable or adequate. But there's a second, distinct kind of shame that shows up specifically in people who choose to remain in the relationship after finding out, and it sounds quite different. I'm weak for staying. People will think I have no self respect. I'm complicit somehow just by being here. That second form isn't really about self worth in the same way. It's about social standing, about anticipated judgment, about the fear of being seen as someone who tolerates something they shouldn't. Researchers studying this have started referring to it as something like internalized staying shame to distinguish it from the shame tied to the betrayal itself. Now, I want to be honest with you about where the evidence actually stands here, because it would be easy to present this distinction as more settled than it is. When I went looking through the literature, I found something genuinely interesting, which is that no study has yet put these two forms of shame side by side and tested statistically whether they're actually separate constructs, the kind of thing researchers would normally do with what's called a confirmatory factor analysis. So, this distinction is at this point theoretically plausible rather than proven. What gives it credibility is that the outcome patterns associated with each form look genuinely different across the studies that do exist. Betrayal shame tends to travel with depression, anxiety, self criticism, and a general erosion of self compassion. Staying shame tends to travel with something else entirely: secrecy, social withdrawal, isolation, and a marked reluctance to ask for help. Those are not the same symptom profile, and that divergence is what makes researchers suspect, even without the formal statistical test yet in hand, that we're looking at two genuinely different psychological processes rather than one shame wearing two masks. So let's stay with staying shame because I think it's the less understood of the two, and it's the one doing most of the work in keeping people isolated. The mechanism researchers describe for how this shame actually forms is worth walking through slowly, because it isn't simply a feeling that appears out of nowhere. It develops in stages. First, A person becomes aware of a cultural stereotype, something like the idea that anyone who stays after infidelity must be weak or naive or somehow lacking self respect. This awareness usually starts early, long before it becomes personally relevant, absorbed the way most cultural messages are absorbed through media, through overheard conversations, through the general tone people take when discussing someone else's marriage. Then, at some point, something researchers call self concurrence happens. The person starts to believe that stereotype actually applies to them specifically. Not just people who stay are weak in the abstract, but I am weak because I am staying. And alongside that belief comes a third piece, an anticipation of discrimination or judgment from real people in their life, which functions almost independently from whether that judgment ever actually arrives. The fear of the reaction does a tremendous amount of psychological work all on its own, often more than the reaction itself would if it actually happened. I think it helps to make this concrete. Picture someone deciding whether to tell a close friend what's happening in their marriage. Before they say a single word, they've already run a kind of simulation. They imagine the friend's face changing. They imagine the friend thinking quietly, "Why would you stay for that?" They imagine being asked questions they don't have good answers for yet. And often, that imagined reaction is enough to close the conversation before it opens, regardless of what the friend would actually say if given the chance. This is part of why disclosure in this context is so often described by researchers as strategic rather than simply reluctant. People aren't randomly withholding information. They are making a fairly sophisticated risk assessment based on real patterns they've observed in how their culture, their family, and their community tend to talk about people who stay. Family and cultural context shape this enormously. And I want to walk through a few different versions of it because the mechanism looks different depending on where you are, even though the underlying function, protecting a certain social order, often looks remarkably similar. In some family systems, researchers describe something close to enforced honor, where the threat isn't subtle. It might involve actual disownment, or at minimum, a very real fear of it, tied specifically to the idea that divorce, or even public acknowledgement of marital trouble, brings disgrace to the entire family, not just to the individual. In that context, staying quiet isn't experienced as a personal choice so much as a duty, something closer to an obligation than a preference. In more collectivist cultural contexts generally, researchers note that a relational rupture like this tends to threaten something bigger than the individual's own identity. It threatens a socially embedded sense of self that was never really separate from the family or community structure to begin with, so the loss doesn't stay contained to the marriage. It ripples outward into questions of belonging that feel existential rather than merely personal. Religious context adds its own layer, and it's worth being specific about the mechanism rather than gesturing vaguely at religion as one big undifferentiated force. Some research describes purity based or heavily gendered religious messaging as framing any relational struggle, even one the person didn't cause, as evidence of a kind of moral failing on their part. Not the failing of infidelity itself, which was someone else's act, but a failing in maintaining the relationship, in being the kind of spouse who prevents that from happening. That framing, subtle as it sounds, can lead people to hide what's happening, specifically to avoid appearing morally compromised in front of a community whose approval genuinely matters to them, sometimes for reasons that go well beyond social comfort, into questions of belonging, belief, and even, in some cases, safety. Then there's the layer that operates almost entirely through informal social channels, which researchers studying various cultural contexts describe as community gossip functioning as a genuine mechanism of social control. This isn't gossip in the trivial gossip column sense. It's closer to an informal surveillance system where neighbors, extended family, and community members actively monitor and comment on a woman's behavior, sometimes intervening directly in what's supposed to be a private relationship. Traditional gender norms get internalized by the people doing the watching, not just by the person being watched. And the effect is that remaining in the marriage can start to feel less like a choice and more like compliance with an audience that's always, in some sense, present. I want to pause here and point out something that might seem like a contradiction, but actually isn't. In some of these honor based or family centered contexts, the pressure runs almost entirely toward staying silently and never speaking of it. But researchers looking at Western individualist contexts, particularly around domestic violence disclosure, describe something closer to the opposite social script, at least on the surface. There, the dominant cultural narrative tends to frame leaving immediately as the only respectable response, and staying, especially staying and continuing to seem distressed about it, gets read as a sign of weakness or a lack of self respect. What I find genuinely striking is that these two cultural scripts, which sound like they're pulling in opposite directions, actually produce the exact same psychological outcome in the person caught between them: silence. Whether the surrounding culture says stay and don't talk about it, or the surrounding culture says you should have left by now, so don't talk about it either, the person ends up in the same place, which is alone with something they've decided not to say out loud. There's a specific piece of resistance work worth mentioning here because I think it complicates the picture in a useful way. Researchers studying the hashtag campaign known as Why I Stayed, which emerged specifically in response to public criticism of women who remained in abusive relationships, found that it functioned as a genuine counter-narrative to the dominant cultural story. Instead of framing staying as evidence of individual weakness, participants surfaced what researchers describe as structural double binds: the concrete financial, legal, familial, and safety related constraints that shape a person's actual range of choices, constraints that are almost entirely invisible from the outside. That kind of public reframing matters because it pushes back directly against the exact mechanism we've been describing: the quiet, internalized belief that staying reflects something broken about the person rather than something genuinely difficult about their circumstances. Gender shapes the specific content of this shame in fairly distinct ways, and it's worth naming both directions rather than only focusing on one. Among women, the internalized narrative researchers describe most often centers on some version of feeling stupid, not having seen it coming, and feeling personally responsible for maintaining the stability of the family, almost as though that stability were her job alone to protect. Among men, the pattern researchers describe leans in a different direction, tied more closely to masculine norms around strength and self sufficiency. Men in this research report significant fear of appearing weak or emasculated, and notably, they reach out for support far less often than women do in comparable situations, which means the isolation, when it happens for men, often happens with even less of a safety net underneath it. Now, I want to shift from where this shame comes from to what it actually does once it's there, because shame isn't just an unpleasant internal state. It shapes behavior in fairly predictable and fairly costly ways. The most immediate effect is concealment, and researchers describe this concealment as selective rather than absolute. People don't simply tell no one. They make careful, almost strategic decisions about who might be safe to tell and who isn't, based largely on how much judgment they anticipate from each specific person. And there's a subtlety in the research here that I think matters a great deal because it complicates a piece of common advice we hear constantly, which is some version of just talk to someone. Studies on secrecy more broadly have found that the psychological harm of keeping a secret doesn't come primarily from the act of concealment itself. It comes from what researchers call intrapersonal mind wandering, the mind repeatedly circling back to the secret on its own, privately, whether or not anyone else ever finds out, which means simply disclosing to another person doesn't automatically resolve the underlying distress if that disclosure is met with judgment, minimization, or pressure. In some cases, As we discussed a little in the last episode when we talked about secondary betrayal, telling the wrong person at the wrong moment can genuinely make things worse, not better. This concealment tends to compound over time into a broader pattern of social withdrawal. And I think it helps to actually walk through the mechanics of how that happens rather than just naming it. When someone is managing a secret, especially one they believe would trigger real social judgment if it came out, ordinary social situations start to feel effortful in a specific way. Every conversation requires low level editing. What can I say? What might slip out? What question might I get asked that I don't want to answer honestly? That constant editing is exhausting in a way that's genuinely hard to appreciate unless you've done it, and over time, many people simply start avoiding the situations that require it. Family gatherings become harder to attend. Casual catch ups with friends get postponed, then postponed again. The person's actual social world starts to contract, not because they stopped caring about the people in it, but because managing the gap between what's true and what's sayable has become its own kind of labor, on top of everything else they're already carrying. There's also a documented effect on what researchers sometimes call agency, meaning a person's felt sense that they can make free, informed decisions about their own life. This might be the part of the research I find most quietly unsettling because it suggests that shame doesn't only make someone feel bad, it measurably narrows their actual options. Without a support network to consult, without anyone to reality check decisions against, without access to practical information about resources, legal options, or even just another perspective, decision making happens in something close to a vacuum. And research on related forms of stigma consistently finds that this isolation is associated with reduced self efficacy, meaning a diminished belief in one's own capacity to actually change the situation, which then feeds directly back into the kind of learned helplessness we discussed in the first episode of this series. The shame isn't just uncomfortable, it's structurally connected to the very immobilization it produces. I want to spend some time now on a question I think doesn't get asked often enough, which is why shame like this persists at all. Why doesn't it simply fade once the initial embarrassment or fear passes? And the answer researchers give is genuinely interesting because it involves understanding what shame is actually built to do in the first place. There's an evolutionary account of shame worth taking seriously here, not because it's the whole story, but because it explains something about why the emotion is so stubborn. The basic idea is that shame functions as an internal alarm system specifically calibrated to detect reputational damage, information that, if it spread through a social group, would lower how others regard you. And the behavioral responses shame triggers, things like averted gaze, a slumped or smaller posture, a general pulling inward, aren't random. They appear to be adaptive attempts to physically minimize the spread of damaging information and to signal appeasement to others, essentially trying to reduce how severely the group responds to whatever the damaging information turns out to be, which means shame, from this angle, isn't a malfunction. It's doing exactly what it evolved to do, protecting reputation by encouraging concealment and withdrawal. But here's the trap, and I think this is the single most important mechanism in this entire episode. The exact behavior shame produces, hiding, withdrawing, avoiding, staying silent, are also the behaviors that block the only process capable of actually resolving shame, which is social contact and honest processing with another person. Shame tells you to hide the thing that's causing it, but hiding the thing is also what prevents you from ever discovering that the reaction you're afraid of might not be as catastrophic as you're imagining, or from receiving the validation that could actually start to metabolize the feeling. So the emotion ends up sealing itself off from the one thing that could resolve it. Researchers describe this as a kind of self perpetuating loop. Shame produces concealment. Concealment prevents resolution. The absence of resolution keeps the shame active, and around it goes. Some researchers go further, describing chronic shame not as a series of discrete, identifiable episodes, but as something closer to a standing orientation toward the world. an ongoing anticipation of exposure that organizes a person's choices, even in moments when they aren't consciously feeling ashamed at all. One researcher describes this using the phrase structures of absence and anticipation, meaning it's not the actual felt experience of shame doing most of the work day to day. It's the constant, low level avoidance of a shame that hasn't happened yet, but might at any moment if the wrong question gets asked or the wrong topic comes up. That's a genuinely different thing from feeling embarrassed in a specific moment. It's closer to a background operating condition, quietly shaping which invitations get accepted, which conversations get steered away from, which relationships stay comfortably shallow because depth would require honesty. When shame doesn't get processed, either because it's being actively avoided or because there's genuinely no safe outlet for it, researchers have documented it surfacing through other channels instead. Some studies describe a connection between unprocessed shame and unexplained physical symptoms, things like persistent fatigue or headaches with no clear medical cause, which fits a broader pattern researchers sometimes call somatization, where emotional material that isn't being consciously worked through finds expression in the body instead. Other research describes a connection between shame and dissociative defenses, an extreme kind of emotional inhibition that essentially walls off awareness of the feeling altogether, which echoes something we discussed in the first episode of this series, though here the dissociation is functioning specifically to manage shame rather than to manage the raw threat of the betrayal itself. I want to be careful here because some of the strongest evidence for these patterns comes from research on other conditions entirely, particularly eating disorders, where a documented cycle exists between shame and behaviors like binge eating, each one feeding the other. That evidence isn't drawn from betrayed spouses specifically, so I don't want to overstate the direct connection. But it does illustrate, in a population where the mechanism has been studied more thoroughly, how shame can become woven into a self reinforcing cycle with whatever coping behavior happens to be available, which is a pattern worth being alert to even when the specific behavior looks different from one situation to the next. Before I close this out, I want to add one more layer because I think it would be a disservice to leave this conversation sounding purely psychological, as though staying shame is simply a distortion in someone's thinking that better information could correct. In a lot of cases, it isn't only a distortion, it's attached to genuinely real structural stakes, and the research on this is fairly stark. Economic dependence shows up repeatedly as a documented barrier to leaving, not just a felt one. In some legal contexts, divorce law itself works against the person who was betrayed, custody arrangements that favor husbands in certain countries, or civil dispute frameworks that can leave a faithful spouse at a financial disadvantage compared to the one who broke the marriage vow. Loss of family support, loss of housing, loss of access to children. These aren't imagined consequences invented by an anxious mind. They're documented outcomes that shape real decisions in real lives, which means, and I think this matters enormously for how we think about all of this, staying shame often sits directly on top of a genuinely rational calculation about real risk. Untangling the emotional distortion from the accurate risk assessment is difficult, and I'd guess it's often impossible to fully separate the two because they've usually become woven together by the time anyone's trying to examine them from the outside. So, where does that leave us? I think it leaves us with a somewhat different way of understanding the silence we started this episode with, the person rehearsing a lie before anyone's even asked them a question. That silence isn't evidence of weak character, and it isn't simply the absence of courage. It's the visible output of a system, cultural, psychological, and in many cases structural, all at once, that has made honesty feel more dangerous than concealment. The shame someone feels about staying was rarely built entirely from the inside. It was assembled piece by piece from cultural stereotypes absorbed long before it became personal, from family and religious expectations about what a good spouse tolerates, from community surveillance disguised as concern, from a surrounding culture that somehow manages to criticize both leaving too slowly and staying too visibly, and from genuinely real material consequences that make the whole calculation far more complicated than any outsider tends to appreciate. Understanding that doesn't make the shame disappear. I don't think understanding a mechanism ever really works that cleanly, and I'd be skeptical of anyone who told you it did. But it does change the question worth asking, both of others and of ourselves. Instead of asking, why is this person still ashamed to admit they've stayed, it becomes more accurate, and I'd argue more useful, to ask what this particular person has learned from a lifetime of cultural messages and very specific personal experiences about what happens to people who tell the truth about their circumstances. In most cases, that's not an irrational fear. It's closer to an accurate prediction built from real evidence about how the people around them are actually likely to respond. That's where I want to leave this episode. Thank you for staying with me through this second installment in our series on betrayal trauma. I'm Esther Adams, and this has been Strides to Solutions.